My name is Peter Jones. I'm a cybersecurity specialist with Cisco. Worked in the industry for longer than I care to remember. Generally, I'm a CISSP and I'm an ethical hacker. So my view of the security world is primarily from a sort of management point of view. I try not to go too deep dive into the technology and the bits and pieces. But hopefully you'll find that interesting. Good. Okay, so this session, really, it's about cybersecurity both for mobile and for network solutions. And who's in the audience is directly involved with cybersecurity for their organization? No? Okay, all right, so just a few. Well, cybersecurity, of course, always a real challenge. And when most people think about cybersecurity, the first thought is, how is this going to stop me from doing my job? Which is always the biggest challenge. So that's something that we're obviously trying to get over. From Cisco's point of view, we absolutely see that cybersecurity is perceived to be a real challenge. Obviously, we see attackers constantly hacking our customers' networks, constantly using the latest technology, very sophisticated threats to get through. And of course, we have the defenders, very limited in their resources typically. A lot of our customers don't have cybersecurity skills per se. It's the IT manager that's typically looking after the security. So we've got this sort of difference in the balance of equation between the two. The attackers have all of the processing power, they have all of the time, and having had a very successful few years, an awful lot of money to attack our accounts. The defenders have to see everything all of the time. And of course, that can be a real challenge. And if they miss just one thing, then of course, that could lead to some possibly devastating effects on their organization. So what are we saying? Well, typically we see three challenges. Obviously, we've got digitization. I think we're probably all familiar with this. Digitization, we're talking about cloud services, mobility, of course, IoT. Cisco expect to see 50 billion devices connecting to the internet by 2020, which is going to be massive. That's a $19 trillion opportunity for the industry, but something that, of course, increases the attack surface for our customers dramatically. Now, while our customers are dealing with these challenges of evolving their networks and introducing more productive ways of working, they're also, of course, being faced with a very active attack landscape as well. So these attackers are becoming very sophisticated in the way that they are attacking our networks, and they're able to evade detection an awful lot as well. So again, we'll take a look at that and see how these people are doing, actually evading detection of simple defenses. And of course, on top of that, then we've got a security marketplace that is absolutely vast. I went to RSA last year, and there were 650 security vendors at RSA. So you have plenty of choice. Obviously, all of these vendors are doing some really interesting things in their own niche. And those products are actually very, very effective in their niche. But they very rarely communicate with each other. They very rarely share threat intelligence. And that makes them quite challenging to deal with. So we see three main challenges. It's the changing business models, it's the dynamic threat landscape, and with us trying to deal with these two challenges, we've actually created the third challenge by ourselves. We've actually invested in some best-of-breed technologies, the best antivirus, the best next-gen firewall, the best IPS, and that's led to a level of complexity which makes it very, very difficult to manage a security architecture. So we know about complexity and fragmentation. We know a fair amount about changing business models. Let's take a look at this dynamic threat landscape and see how that's actually worked out. Now, I've done a classic here. You can't hear that. But I'm going to pass that to you. Please remember to turn off your mobile phones before the presentation. Now, Cisco actually published the annual cybersecurity report just last month. And this is a review of over 3,000 accounts around the world, their view of security and their security challenges. So I thought what I'll do is I'll just pick out the highlights of this, the things that I found most interesting, and one of the biggest challenges, of course, that our customers are seeing around the world. Now, in summary, we're generally seeing a massive uplift in the sophistication of the malware that is targeting our attacks, our accounts. They're able to get through basic defenses. So if you have antivirus, if you have IPS, if you're using these elements, you've got to expect that at some point, malware is going to get past those devices. And of course, that's something that you need to deal with. Now, in addition to that, malware is evading detection. There are plenty of techniques now in order to, as I say, get past an antivirus solution. And we'll dig into a couple of those as we go along. And of course, the third one is that because we've developed a security architecture that is effectively built up with multiple security elements, getting through the gaps that are left between those elements becomes fairly straightforward. And again, we'll talk about that in just a second. So, encryption. Everyone's aware of encryption and what it does? Yep. Okay, it's a very, very good tool to enable productivity for your organization. So encryption allows us to have confidentiality within our data. So that means we can use it for internet banking, we can use it for internet shopping, we can use it for hiding malware and getting into your organization without being noticed. It can be, there's two sides to this coin. And what we've seen now is an increase in the use of encryption to hide malware, to get into your organization, and then, of course, do the deed. This is especially true when we talk about command and control callouts. Now, we obviously don't need to go too technical with this, but typically when you deliver a piece of malware into an organization, that malware wants to call out to some command and control site that will then maybe deliver a payload. And we're seeing that command and control call out being encrypted. And that's increased massively over the last couple of years. So now when we think about web proxy technologies and those other type of technologies, we can bypass those technologies to get out if you're not decrypting that web traffic. So again, that's a very easy way of delivering malware. This is quite interesting. Email is still the major, or actually the most prevalent form of attack for any organization. It may not be the sexiest, but it is actually the most prevalent form. I think we're seeing, well, certainly Office documents within an email account for about 38% of all malware attacks right now. So even though we're seeing Office document attacks decreasing by a level of about 55%, it's still the most prevalent way of issuing malware into an organization. So that's still something to consider. Second place to standard Office documents is archive documents at 37%. Now again, an archive document is a standard zip or RAW file that would contain additional files within it. And for most organizations, we typically just scan that first file that we see, and therefore we don't scan the files that were contained within a zip file. Again, very easy way of delivering malware and getting past any maybe email defenses. And of course, the last one, that's down at 14%, is PDF files. Again, very easy to actually include maybe a Word document within a PDF. Your defenses typically would just scan the PDF file and not look any deeper than that. So we need to think about how we're actually scanning these files, whether we're actually going deep enough to be able to detect this sort of evasive techniques. Now, again, quick question for the audience. Who's heard of Sandbox Technology? Okay, all right, most of you, that's good. For those that didn't raise your hand, a sandbox is effectively a safe place to execute a file. So if a file comes into your organization, you can put it into a sandbox, we'll execute that file, and we'll see whether it contains any malicious code. Very good. Now, what we noticed over the last couple of years is that anyone that's been using a sandbox has been sitting there quite comfortable that they've got their defenses in place. What they didn't notice was that there was a small hole in their sandbox, and that is that when you typically put a file into a sandbox environment, it will open up that attachment, it will examine that file, and it will give it a reputation score. That's absolutely fine. What it doesn't do is then close down that file completely. It will release the file onto the network, and everyone moves on with their day job. What we saw last year was that because of this weakness in the sandbox technology, people were issuing malware that would actually deploy on close. So as soon as you closed the document, it would deploy the malware. And that was enough to get through most people's sandbox technology. And again, it's quite interesting to see that as soon as these vulnerabilities are detected, the spike just increases dramatically. As soon as people recognize that there is a hole in a sandbox, then people jump on this and deploy malware and use this technique in order to get into your organization. That's the same is true for embedded documents in PDF. As soon as we saw that there was a weakness and you could embed a document within a PDF and basically skip over most people's security devices, then we saw a peak in the traffic of that particular attack, and that all happened at the end of 2017. So again, it's just interesting to see that when you deploy security throughout your organization, it's not just a set and forget technology. It's not something that you can just say, right, I've bought my IPS, I've bought my antivirus, now we're secure. These things are evolving all of the time, and as a result, you need to be on top of it all of the time. If you neglect your IPS, then the chances are within a very short period of time, you'll be letting these sort of attacks through and onto your network. Now, again, a bit of a show of hands. Who's heard of WannaCry and Nuetnia? Yep, okay. This was a big attack that happened last year. The WannaCry, it was actually very, very interesting because with WannaCry, it was standard ransomware that was being used, but it was being used in a very interesting way. Typically, with ransomware, you would receive a file, you would click on that file, it would then download a payload, which would then encrypt all of your data on your PC. That's all well and good. WannaCry was one of the first pieces of ransomware that we had seen that was automatically deploy across an organization. It didn't need any user intervention at all. So we would see that achieving the lateral movement across organizations, affecting all of their unpatched machines. Now, of course, that had a devastating effect for an awful lot of organizations. What's probably more interesting is that WannaCry, although it used some very sophisticated technology, the way it was compiled was actually very basic, and especially the end game, which is collecting the payment for the ransomware, was actually quite ineffective. The whole process was automated to deploy across as many networks as it could possibly touch, but the actual payment was manual, and therefore they achieved very little in terms of return for that WannaCry attack. Now, a conclusion that we draw from this and from the information that we got from the Nuetnia attacks as well is that the chances are they're testing the network. So these are attacks that are just understanding how far they can reach, how far they can get, how quickly they can actually spread across either a particular country or a particular industry. Now they've got that information to hand, we expect to see a lot more of these attacks, possibly a lot more targeted than they were before. So again, ransomware is a challenge for everybody, but ransomware 2.0, this automatic deployment of ransomware, can really have a devastating impact, not just on a company, but on a nation as well. So do keep an eye on this. Expect to receive attacks in the future that will not only evade detection, but will automatically deploy throughout your organization. Now, how can you protect against that? Well, basic patching of the network is always a good idea, but also segmentation can be a bit challenging, but if you can segment your network, that definitely helps as well. And of course, we'll have other solutions that will be able to detect that sort of thing. Now, the last point that I want to raise for security and network security is IoT. This is Internet of Things. Now, what I mean by this is video cameras, air quality sensors, basically all of those things that are collecting data across your network that you may or may not be aware of. Now, again, this is fairly interesting because in a lot of cases, the IoT elements are not actually managed by the IT team. They're typically managed by the physical estates team. So therefore, they've been deployed. They don't have any security on them. They've very rarely been updated, if ever. And most of the time, these are not visible to the IT team. So they are absolutely the low-hanging fruit for an attacker to be able to take over those devices and then use them either against you as an organization or to use them to launch denial of service attacks against somebody else. And we saw last year the first 1 terabyte denial of service attack hitting the DNS service. I don't know, you may recall last year that just for a couple of days, Twitter and Netflix and Facebook just went down. That was a denial of service attack that was actually generated by about 20,000 video cameras. All launched, as I say, they hit over a 1 terabyte DDoS attack. Now we're seeing that organized crime units are able to take over more than 100,000 IoT devices in less than 24 hours. So again, this is escalating massively, and we need to be aware of these threats and able to protect against them. Now, I mentioned earlier about a lack of resource and the fact that most organizations actually are using their IT team as their security organization. Well, that's absolutely true, and I think most people would recognize that. But when you actually look at the statistics about how effective that is, it's a little bit scary. When we see the number of alerts that are actually reported to our 3,000 customers, about 44% of those alerts were not investigated at all. They were just pushed to one side. Out of the 56% that were investigated, about a third of those were actually legitimate attacks that could do some serious damage. Only about half of those legitimate attacks were actually actioned and remediated. So you can see that we're really missing a trick here. We're seeing thousands and thousands of attacks coming in, hitting our networks, but we only have the resources to be able to respond to really the bare minimum. And that means we're leaving our organizations exposed. I think the point of this message is that security, yes, it's about technology, but it's also about people and process. And there's no point in investing in vast amounts of money in tin to secure your network if you're not backing that up with the people and the processes that actually make all this effective. So, the title of the presentation, how can we change this equation? How can we turn this around? I've given you all the bad news, so now let's think about some of the good news. What we want to do is change the advantage. At the moment, the attackers have that advantage. They have the time, the money, and the processing power to be able to deliver any attack they like. We have very limited resources. So what are we going to do to turn that around? Well, in Cisco's eyes, it's all about asking the right question. And the first question here is, are we secure? Now, I think most people know the answer to that. The answer is no matter how much security you've bought in the last couple of years, you're not. Nobody is going to be 100% secure. So what do we need to do then is maybe ask a different question. Do we have an effective security posture? Now, that's an effective security posture for you and your organization. Again, slightly more challenging question to actually answer, but it gives you a starting point rather than trying to go for that nirvana of 100% security to actually understand what is required for your organization. So what do we mean when we say an effective security posture? Well, this is where really the world has changed in security. If we went back maybe, I'd say 4 or 5 years, it was all about stopping all of the malware from getting into the organization. So you'd use VPNs and firewalls and antivirus and a whole load of other security tools and try and build up the walls as high as you possibly can to stop that malware getting into the organization. Now, it's all about stopping as much as you possibly can, but accepting that at some point, malware is going to touch your network. So now, It's about detecting that network, or that malware, and then closing that time to detection and that ability to be able to respond. Now, right now, industry average to detect unknown malware on a network is somewhere between 100 and 200 days. I know, that's 6 months. This is why we say the attackers have time. They can effectively sit on your network for as long as they like, knowing they're not going to be detected, exfiltrating data or mining your data, doing whatever they want to do for weeks, if not months on end. What we need to do is now close this gap. So as soon as that malware hits the network, we pick it up, we detect it, and we give you the tools to be able to respond to that attack as quickly as possible. Industry average, about 100 to 200 days. Cisco, at the moment, we've brought this down to 3.5 hours. The intention, of course, is to bring it down into the minutes. Now, as soon as we bring it down into the minutes, we start changing that equation. Because what we're doing is we're actually reducing that window of opportunity for an attacker to do the damage that he's trying to achieve that lateral movement, to reach or to escalate the privileges, the admin privilege that he may have, to reach the PII information that perhaps is his target goal, or even to do just the destructive damage that he might be planning using things like ransomware. So that's really our goal. As I say, today we're at approximately 3.5 hours. We want to bring that down into minutes. And the way that we're doing that is by taking a twofold approach. Firstly, thinking about security across the entire architecture. So not only about mobile and network, but also bring in behavioral analytics as well. Think about the email security. Think about web security. Organizations may now be considering about cloud services, bringing those into the picture. How do you secure the cloud in the same way that you can your local area network? And how can you respond to a breach when perhaps half of your data is in the cloud and the other half is on site? VPN technology as well. Third parties coming into your organization, how can we protect them? Not only when they're VPNing into your organization, but what about when they're not VPNing into your organization, when they're off network? If they're carrying around maybe an Apple device or a laptop, they take it into a Starbucks, they pick up a piece of malware, then they VPN directly into your organization, is that actually going to cause you a problem? So again, thinking about the whole architecture is absolutely key. So having that portfolio in place, important, but having the integration between all of those elements so they're able to share threat intelligence between each point. Now, the objective here is that if we see a threat once, we're able to protect the network everywhere. So whether that threat comes in on the network, whether it comes through an endpoint, whether it comes through your VPN connection, whether it comes via an email, we can pick up that threat, we can identify it to be malicious, and then we can share that threat intelligence across all of your users automatically. Now, when we have that ability, we can start to move into real-time security and automated security. Now, I say start to move into because that can be very challenging in itself. If you're going to automate a response, you need to ensure that you're not seeing any false positives within your reporting. Now, if we can pull information from the endpoint, from the IPS, from the network, correlate that information together and say, actually, these 3 threat feeds together tell me that something dodgy is going on and we need to take action, then we can do that with a level of confidence that makes sense. So again, we're just changing that process from just building the walls high and hoping nothing gets in, to accepting that at some point there will be a breach, but having the tools in place to be able to respond and react, not within days or weeks, but within hours and minutes, and make sure that we're able to protect the organization as best we possibly can. Now, it would be rude to have a presentation here today and not mention GDPR. So we couldn't get through the whole day without mentioning GDPR once. But of course, we're all aware of GDPR. We're all aware of the challenges that it brings. Now, with a breach, there is a regulation within GDPR that says we need to inform the regulator within 72 hours of that breach. So as soon as you identify a breach, being able to understand the extent of that breach and then report it accurately to the regulator is going to be very, very important. And you can imagine, when you hear of a breach coming in, the first questions that will be asked is, when did that breach first appear? Who let it into the organization? How many hosts has it touched? Did it get through to any PII information? What do I need to do to remediate the networking and get back to normal operations? These are really difficult questions to answer, and typically you require a third party to come in, and you need to spend an awful lot of money with those guys to try and find the answers to those questions. What we're planning to do, or we have in place today, is a solution that will allow you to answer those questions as soon as the breach is detected. Now, if you've got those tools in place, you've got the power to be able to remediate and protect the network. So that was pretty much it. Hopefully, I didn't talk about too many products, but happy to answer any questions.